Okay, so last time we defined language and basically ended up with the functional definition, a means of communication, and then delimited it further as a subtype of communication when you have an open lexicon mapped onto a recursive grammar. We defined something. And today we're going to talk about generating definitions, because definitions are important. A lot of times when people are having a combative, persistent disagreement kind of argument, where their logical arguments fail to convince each other, it's because they have different definitions of a word, but the word sounds the same, so they probably don't know that they have different definitions. But based on those different definitions, one person thinks something's a good argument, but the other person with their other definition hears that and thinks that's an irrelevant argument. And yeah, it's irrelevant to their idea of the issue based on their definition of a term. And so they just keep giving arguments that fail to convince. Like, here's a few topics that could be issues of debate. Does God exist? Do you believe in true love? Should the Federal Reserve do quantitative easing? And those are three very simple questions. Except for the words God, true love, and quantitative easing. And even attempting to answer those questions, though simple, should they do it? Does it exist? Do you believe in it? Questions would be really, really hard if we don't know what those three terms mean. And a lot of times people think they know what they mean, and someone else thinks they know what they mean, but those are two different meanings. And when those two people try to debate each other, usually it just gets ugly and produces more light than heat. When arguments seem to be unsuccessful like that, it's a good idea to check that everyone has the same definitions of important terms. So, a chapter on definitions. What are words? Basically, they're labels for... Most fundamentally, words tend to be labels for things. Like cat is, at least in English, a label for a certain kind of animal. Junk, person, phone, labels for things. Those are nouns. We also have verbs, labels for actions. Speaking, podcasting. And then we have a world full of objects and actions. We also, nouns and verbs. We also have comparatives. Adjectives compare nouns. Or this noun is big, that noun is small. We have comparatives for verbs too. He runs quickly, he runs slowly. So fast, slow, or quickly, slowly, big, small. We have comparatives, words that we use to add description to nouns and verbs. And if that's all we had, well, it gets really confusing if you just had a long string of nouns or a long string of verbs. Like, it generally makes sense if you pair, like, one noun, one verb. But if you made long strings of just those, it would get confusing. Which is why animals tend to keep their sentences very short to 1 or 2 words. To navigate recursive grammar, human languages tend to have more kinds of words. Even with the modifier words, adjectives and adverbs, those still count as content words. Well, what's the other option besides content words? Function words. And it, and the, in, thereby. What are those labels for? They're not really labels for specific things. I can't here's an and. Oh yeah, this is a, here and after. They don't really work like that. Those words, function words, are more like arrows. They represent connections between content words that are real things, nouns or verbs. Logic itself has a similar pattern. There are propositions, statements, that are true or false, don't have to know which. And then there are syllogisms, connections between the statements. At the lexical level, function words are like syllogisms, they're arrows connecting, and content words are more like propositions, things. And we do things to those things. But basically, words are conventions about what certain sounds or letter combinations or characters mean. And they're just conventions. Different languages have different words for cat. What characters, letters, or sounds represent that animal is arbitrary. The signs are arbitrary. Arbitrariness is another feature of human language. But we don't need to talk about arbitrariness that much. Now let's get into the dimensions of definitions. There is the formal denotation, what a word literally means. But then there's also connotations, what the word doesn't really mean, but what it's associated with, what it makes you think of. Like, at the level of denotation, popular and prima donna would be pretty much the same, but prima donna has connotations of not just having attention, not just getting a lot of attention, but demanding and needing and being addicted to and usurping attention. It's a very subtle difference. At some point, definitions have core denotations, but then they're surrounded by a cloud of connotations that are mostly related to emotions and judgments. Basically emojis. We have a lot of nonverbal subtle cues for connotations in verbal intonation, but one thing that you use emojis for is to literally mark connotations. Well, they're not that important, though. I hope. I often, don't look too closely and end up confusing the laughing so hard that you're crying emoji with the crying out of sadness emoji. It's not good when someone's like, my grandmother died, and you send the laughing so hard that you're crying emoji. Like, why is she mad at me? Like, oh, I meant to do the normal crying emoji. Yeah, connotations can be hard. And they differ from context to context. But previously we mentioned that definitions are arbitrary conventions. We saw that with words. The Chinese word for a small, furry feline, a cat, and the English word for Mao are not the same thing. The sounds are arbitrary. And the arbitrariness of definitions is important. That's where people start talking to each other, arguing for one thing, other person's expecting to hear an argument for another thing. Wow, that guy's arguments are always irrelevant. That guy's arguments are always irrelevant. He's an idiot. He's an idiot. And no one really convinces each other. So it's useful for us as critical thinkers to always be checking definitions. Check our definitions. Check other people's definitions. Make sure that they match. Make sure that the other person even has a clear definition. If they can articulate a clear definition of what they think the word means, then good luck. Maybe you'll help them realize that they're not making sense. Definitions that we find in a dictionary are just average conventions of what most people think a word means. However, sometimes we need to be more precise with language than that. Like in a contract, maybe for some employment contract, maybe part-time employees are treated differently than full-time employees in some way, for some reason, doesn't matter what. They're just treated differently depending on whether you're part-time or full-time. Where's the line between part-time and full-time? 25 hours? 30 hours? 34 hours? In one country, at one time, in one company, in one person's mind, they might have a different number in mind than someone else does. Maybe I think the cut point is 32 hours per week. Someone else thinks it's 30. Then we get a case of some guy who's working 31 hours. Disagreement! And disagreements are generally bad. One person's treating him one way, another person thinks he should be treated the other way. Who knows what he thinks? Breach of contract! You're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. The way to prevent retroactive you did it wrongs, which are generally not fun, is to stipulate definitions. Which means to almost have your own little dictionary, where you define exactly, you say exactly, this is what this word means when used within this document. Full-time employee is defined as a person who works more than 34 hours a week. Oh, 34. I thought it was 30. The stipulated definition corrects people before misunderstandings occur. So when writing a contract or reading one, stipulated definitions are important. And contracts can be important. Not reading a contract can be bad. Hopefully a course on critical thinking will make you a lot better at reading, understanding, and taking apart and debating contracts. It's a big part of some people's lives, and it's not always easy. It's one application of critical thinking. Okay, so we're going to stipulate a definition. Writing. Yep. Now I'm going to have to be the author of a mini dictionary. I have to write a definition. How do you write a good definition? Well, there's a couple things to watch out for. The first one's, vagueness, ambiguity, and a special type of ambiguity called amphibole. More words. Before we define those words, let's talk about a broader set of criteria for good definitions. Or rather bad definitions. Ideally, a definition won't be obscure. As in, the words in the definition won't be harder to understand than the word you're defining. A great example of that would be early on when I said, try to define language. And we're like, okay, language, that's a somewhat difficult word. And then I define language as an open-ended lexicon mapped onto a recursive grammar. And we're like, whoa, open-ended lexicon, recursive grammar. The words in the definition were even harder to understand than the definition itself. You don't want that to happen, or at least you don't want to stick with that in the end. Sometimes an obscure definition is the most concise and accurate way to say something. And so we like it, but it's obscure. The way to fix an obscure definition is to then go give definitions of each of those obscure words that are in the bad definition. Because after we went through that whole 15-minute explanation, an open-ended lexicon mapped onto a recursive binarily branching grammar, it's actually a really good definition. But we can only understand that the definition is good after we had defined all the words in it. It was like the obscure definition was just a pre-definition. Another thing that a definition shouldn't be is negative. Ideally, you'd say what a thing is, not what a thing isn't. Because there's a real lot of things that a thing isn't. The whole rest of the universe. Like, if I try to define God and just said, God is not mortal, God is not evil. Okay. But if you wanted to list all the things that something's not, we could be here for a while. A negative definition's better than nothing, but generally it's not exactly what we want. At least, well, sometimes we can't get away from it. Like, if I try to define bald, baldness is not having hair on your head. That not part is very important. Like, if we try to define bald without using any negative words, the definition would just be way longer. So sometimes definitions have to be negative. Like orphan, a child who doesn't have parents. A workaround would just be more trouble than it's worth. Also, a definition shouldn't be circular. It might be true, but it won't be very helpful. It'll be tautological. Like, let's say someone was like, well, what do you mean by God? And I tried defining God as the Supreme Being. Well, the Supreme Being is... I equally have no clue what that actually means. It's just as useless as God. Sure, you could define it that way, but that definition, even if it's true, is not very useful. So circular definitions we want to stay away from, assuming we want our definition to be useful. Now back to the original criteria for good definitions that I was going to get into. Vagueness, ambiguity, and amphibole. Let's go back to that example of bald. I used baldness for a negative definition, not having hair. It's also a great definition of vagueness. Am I bald? Sort of. We don't really have a clear cut point for baldness. Like if I said, stop that man! And you were like, which one? The bald one! The tall, bald guy. Yet if we were in a crowd and you're like, okay, get the tall, bald... Is that guy... He's sort of bald. He's sort of tall. Is that the one you mean? That one? Which is the tallest, baldest person here? Oh, wait a minute. That guy's very tall. That guy's very bald. Which one's the bald and tallerist? Sometimes definitions are vague. Baldness and tallness, well, they're continuous variables. It's like old. Is 30 old? 50 old? 70 old? Is 70 and 50 old but 30 not old? Well, it's vague. With fuzzy analog logic, we can deal with vagueness, but logic and even, to a lesser but substantial degree, language tend to be pretty binary. It's not easy to deal with vagueness. It can be done, but it takes a little more work. So we don't want definitions to be vague. What else can be wrong? Or what else can be a problem to watch out for? Besides vagueness, there's ambiguity. Let's say you gave me this book and I said, I'll waste no time reading it. What am I going to do? Am I going to read it immediately, not wasting any time on any other activity before I start reading it? Or am I not going to read it at all, because any time spent on reading it would be time wasted because it's boring? Could be either one. I could do either one, and I would still be not wasting time reading it. The actionable operational definition of not wasting time reading it is ambiguous. It's not vague in that we don't know where a cut point is. Sort of bald, very bald, not bald at all. We don't really know with that half-bald guy. Rather, there's two completely different possible interpretations. That's ambiguity. In wasting no time reading it, that's a thing. It's, I guess it would be a very weird verb. But it's a thing, it's a lexeme, it's a lexical item. And we don't know the definition of that thing. That's basic ambiguity. Well, we know it's one of two things, we just don't know which exactly. That's normal ambiguity. Now let's look at amphiboly, a special case of ambiguity. I saw the man with binoculars. Seeing, man, eye, binoculars. Okay, none of these words are ambiguous. None of them are vague. We're good, right? Okay. Who has the binoculars? Me or the man? Maybe I have binoculars and I use those binoculars to see that other guy. Or maybe I'm here, the other guy's here, and that guy has some binoculars around his neck. Oh yeah, that guy, the one who has binoculars. Or maybe even we both have binoculars. Maybe I'm far away and using binoculars to look at that other guy who has some binoculars around his neck. We don't know. Okay, so we don't know what it exactly means, but none of the words are vague, and none of the words have two interpretations. There's not ambiguity. How is there uncertainty? Well, the uncertainty is not lexical. It's not a word or string of words that is ambiguous. Rather, the syntax is ambiguous. We don't really know which noun, the subject or the object, I or the man, with binoculars modifies. Is it, I saw something. Something equals the man with binoculars. Is it, I? Or is it, I saw the man, and I happened to do it by using binoculars? We're not sure which noun the adjective or prepositional prepositional adverbial phrase with binoculars. We're not sure which noun, I or the man, that, or both, that phrase modifies. So it's ambiguous, but the ambiguity is grammatical rather than lexical. That's amphiboly. You want to ideally watch out for those things when writing or reading definitions. If you're good, you can sneak those in, and then you have options that people don't know you have. Or if someone writes a contract and their definitions are vague, ambiguous, or amphibolious, and they don't know it, then there's uncertainty that you might be able to exploit to give yourself more options than they think that they've given you. That's sort of lawyer stuff, but the basic job of a lawyer is to use language proficiently and use language to the greater advantage of his clients. And lawyers are expensive or hard to find. Well, they're not hard to find in America, but they are expensive. So if you can do that work yourself, you save yourself a lot of hassle and money. So we're trying to write a definition, and we know what not to do. Oh, come on, you said don't be negative in your definitions, and you just told us don't be vague, don't be ambiguous, don't be amphibolious. What do we do? Come on, Justin, do you have to always break a rule right after you say it, and then spend the next half hour undoing your violation? Sorry. So, we're trying to write some definitions. There's a few ways to do that. There's a few words with which we can describe definitions. Let's say you didn't know what a lizard was. and I just started listing different reptiles. And I just started pointing at a bunch of different lizards in the zoo. Those are lizards. After I've pointed to enough examples, you'd sort of get the idea of what a lizard was. Even if you hadn't really studied English and the word lizard was new to you. That would be an ostensive definition. Ostendere was Latin for to give examples. Definition by examples. If we got through every single lizard in the world, we would have the referential extension of the word lizard. However, there's a lot of lizards in the world. For any word, getting through its referential extension is usually not practical. So we need something else, another strategy. And the referent is what the word points to. The sounds, letters, and characters of a word are arbitrary. But what the word points to isn't. And what the word points to is called the referent. So, since listing every single thing in a referential extension is too time-consuming, we'll go for another strategy. We'll try to write an algorithm for a word. We'll try to say its referential criteria. Okay, so we're gonna... technically, referential criteria plus referential extension is called the essential definition. But the important part of an essential definition is the referential criteria. Although, sometimes we can get away with just listing a few synonyms, starting to list the referential extension. But really, we're after the criteria. So, how would we go about writing the referential criteria for a word? A good starting point, but not a good ending point, is the genus and differentia approach. Like, let's say we're trying to define the word square. What is a square? Writing definitions is hard! What we might start with would be to look at what's the big category that squares are in. Are they food? Are they animals? No, they're geometric shapes. So squares go within the category of shapes. Okay, so we're talking about shapes. We know the genus. And then we try to talk about what differentiates squares from other shapes. Differentia of a square. Well, it has 4 sides, right angles, the sides are equal length. And we start listing criteria that make squares, the species, different from other things in the big genus category of shapes. But how do we know that we got those differentiating criteria? How do we know that we've got that right? Like, we've listed a few good things. Do we know that we've got all of them? Do we know that what we have are all good? The genus and differentia approach is a useful way for getting a starting point. But then, let's see if we can do a little better. Let's describe the elements, describe the criterion. Talk about the elements of that differentiating list. What kinds of things could go on it? Well, aside from irrelevant conditions, stupid stuff, there are necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. Okay, what's the difference? They help us rule features in as criteria and they help us rule examples in and rule examples out. With a sufficient criterion, that helps us rule something in. If you know it's sufficient criteria, you don't need to know anything else about it. You're good. Like, you don't need to know something's age or color to know whether it's a square. Those are unnecessary criteria. Squares do have colors, but color is not within the criteria that are necessary. A sufficient condition allows you to rule something in, but sufficiency, that sounds more like an endpoint, where we really tend to focus our time and our effort is on deciding on necessary criteria. Because when I try to give a definition of sufficient criterion, I sort of looped back to unnecessary criterion. So it looks like necessary criterions are where it's at. So what does necessary criterion mean? It means a way to rule something out. If it only has 3 sides, it's definitely not a square. Even if it's the same color as things that are squares, if it doesn't have the right number of sides, it's definitely not a square. So we start lifting for our differentiating criteria. We start lifting necessary features, necessary criteria. It has to have 4 sides. A shape that has 4 sides. We're getting somewhere. That rules out triangles and pentagons. Okay, so a square is a shape that has 4 sides. Well, talk to you later, guys. No. Is that definition too narrow or too broad? We iteratively get a definition, then go back and check. Too narrow, too broad. If our definition was squares are red shapes that have 4 sides, that would be too narrow in some ways. There are green squares. Oh, I found a counterexample. The green, it's obviously a square, obviously not red. One of those criteria is wrong. Greenness. Get color out of here. Okay, so squares are 4-sided shapes of any color. Cool. See you next time, guys. No, then you notice, what about this shape? What about, there's another side here. What about rectangles? What about rhomboids? Or rhombuses? If the sides aren't all of equal length, it still has 4 sides, it's still a shape. Okay, we'll say the sides need to be equal lengths. But then there's rhombuses. Sides are equal length, but it's still not very squarey. Technically, it's not even a rectangle. Okay, so another criterion. The angles also have to be equal, 90 degrees. And then we try, okay, we've been wrong a few times, so we keep looking for counterexamples. But once we have shape with 4 sides that are equal length and the angles are equal 90 degrees. After a while, we were trying to find counterexamples, and we just can't find any. At that point, we have a sufficient and not excessive, sufficient and minimal set of necessary conditions. We have all the necessary differentiating criteria and no unnecessary ones. We have the referential criteria of a square. Squares are pretty easy. Like, we could just go to a dictionary and look it up. And so the dictionary saves us a lot of work trying to redefine words. And usually people, when they use a language, they choose to abide by the conventions of the dictionary. Generally. But what about something like part-time employee? What about something that's vague? Or even if you count contractors, ambiguous. A lot of the times, well, you could just stipulate that you're going with the definition in some dictionary. But a lot of the times, a dictionary isn't precise enough. Or its definition is not exactly what you really want to talk about. So, in precise language, which is the only kind of language that really solves arguments and advances society, we often need to have clear stipulated definitions. And a lot of the time, well, definitions are arbitrary, so a lot of the times just taking this dictionary definition is a poor fit. And so we need to stipulate our own definitions, which is why we need to know how to make definitions and judge definitions. Is this circular, negative, too obscure and not clarified? Are any of the terms in the definition vague? Are any of the terms ambiguous? Is the syntactic way that the terms are put together ambiguous, at least in the language I'm working, or ambivalous in the language I'm working in? Are the criterion sufficient? Are there any unnecessary criteria? Are all the necessary criteria here? Writing good definitions is the first step. It's an early step in critical thinking. I think Confucius had a book like The Rectification of Names. Supposedly sometimes someone asked him what's the first thing he would do if some king said, "Hey, Confucius, you're prime minister, you're in charge, clean up the world." And I think he said one of the first things he would do would be the rectification of names. Make languages labels match reference more closely. Like, whether you could really have one guy go around dictating the definitions, whether that would work or not is debatable. But the project in the abstract is the same as what we did, at least in a schematic sense, in this chapter, talking about what a definition is, what to watch out for in making one, and how to make a good definition. Yep, of course, this video probably won't come to you in very high definition, but it's just words. Words don't need 60 frames per second and 4K resolution. Hope the definition of definition came to you in at least adequate definition.